Welcome. I'm David Levi Strauss, the chair of the MFA program in Art Criticism and Writing here at the School of Visual Arts. When I came into this series 4 years ago, the first person I asked to speak in the series was Linda Nochlin, and I've been asking her ever since, every year, nearly every season, and this is the 7th season of the series. Finally, I've got her. Persistence matters. I met Linda some years ago when we were both on our way to Miami for some conference or another. I recognized her in the airport, and I went up to her and told her that she was the only critic I knew whose writing appeared regularly in both Art Forum and Art in America. At the time, this was highly unusual. And this started a conversation that lasted for most of the week in Miami. We had a great time. Linda Nochlin has one of the most distinguished careers of any art historian anywhere, but her writing on art has always been direct and accessible to a broad audience. This is something she shared with Leo Steinberg, who she met when they were both graduate students at the NYU Institute of Fine Arts in 1953. When Leo died earlier this year, Linda wrote a eulogy for him that was published in Art in America. Rereading Steinberg's 1962 essay on Jasper Johns, Nochlin wrote, "Once more, I am swept along by the sheer force of its internal dialectic." He asked the same questions I asked about Johns and his little-known work back then, and answers them both precisely and expansively, each answer leading me on to the next question. This is exciting stuff. There's nothing arcane or theoretical about it. The arguments are open to ordinary understanding." Unquote. This is something that one could also say about Nochlin's own writing. She is the Lila Acheson Wallace Professor of Modern Art at the New York University Institute of Fine Arts. She tore into the methodological assumptions of art history beginning at least in 1971 with her seminal essay, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" and continued to open the field up to new ways of thinking with Women, Art, and Power and Other Essays in 1988, Women in the 19th Century Categories and Contradictions in 1997, and Representing Women in 1999. Other books include The Body in Pieces, The Fragment as a Metaphor of Modernity in 2001, Bather's Body's Beauty, The Visceral Eye in 2006, and Courbet in 2007. And there are many others. And she's produced a constant stream of writings on contemporary and modern artists and co-curated a number of important exhibitions. Now I'm exhausted. Tonight she's going to talk about Géricault and Goya. Please welcome Linda Nochlin.
I think I'll stand up.
Yeah.
What I'm going to be talking to you about, I want to thank you, first of all, for a very uplifting introduction, energizing, let's say. And I want to say that what I'm talking about tonight is part of a much longer study of the theme of misère, misery, after the Industrial Revolution. What I'm talking about is economic misery. And the two major figures I'll be talking about tonight are Géricault and Goya, and they're very different interpretations of the theme of economic misery at the beginning of the 19th century. But I am also going to go on to ask some questions about the documentary mode itself in general, documentary photography, the anti-documentary moment of our own time, and so on. So there are going to be a lot of questions. And this is still open stuff. I mean, I'm still fooling around with this. I'm still, I've given one lecture at the Reina Sofia, which was more on Courbet and misery, and now I'm going on to backward to Goya and Géricault, and I want to work on the Threepenny Opera at some point. This will all be part of my book, which I hope will appear someday. Okay, what you're looking at here is one of my favorite visual images. I spent the whole summer in Paris looking at it. When I first saw it, I cried. I cried. Is the art historian allowed to cry? Yes, I permitted myself to cry. You know, why not? I am not totally objective or totally feelingless, and this just seems to me one of the saddest and most beautiful images in the 19th century. It is called, this is the version of the lithograph avant la lettre, that is before the printed matter was put on the bottom. It's an early stage. Géricault is still not wasting the stone. He's doing stuff around the edges, as so many printmakers did at that time. And there are also views of city streets in London in 1821 when he did this. Pity the sorrows of a poor old man is what this is called, and that is actually the title of a very popular song of the period, which people sang. And this is really the essence of misery, misère, poverty, deprivation. Even the layering of the clothing of the poor old man. Let's see some details over there. The layering of the clothing of the poor old man refers at once to his poverty and to his past. He is obviously carrying everything on his back. A suggestion, as in the popular verse about this, that he was once prosperous. He once led a better life. His broken top hat, his overcoat, his jacket, the layers of underwear, and notice how many layers there are. He really is wearing it all, and how full of holes they are. And what we can see of his face is handsome and rather refined, certainly not caricatural or grotesque as it would be in the popular prints of the time. It is certainly more refined than the faces of the rather commercial-looking couple in the bakery window behind him. Notice, too, the contrast of his exhausted gesture with his open hand and the active, vulgar, grasping gesture of the bakery woman and her customer. And the further contrast of the gentle, loving, reassuring paw in the lower right of the image on his knee. The dog, clearly a mutt, is the only living creature to care about this remnant of humanity. Géricault defines it, discarded on the streets of London. And this detail, this knee, this paw, this dog, are surely the center point of the print. They are not a punctum, the Roland Barthes sense of something irrelevant that catches your attention when you look at a photograph, but on the contrary, they're the very essence of its meaning. The diminished, yet intense and intensely moving synecdoche of lost feeling and humanity, caught within the immense social uncaringness of 1820s London, with its brick and stone surfaces. And as such, it is a very different trope, isn't this wonderful, from that of Landseer in his similar but slickly sentimental, one of the favorite pictures of the public of the period, The Old Shepherd's Chief Mourner, a few years later, where you have the dog mourning on the casket of his disappeared owner. Set against the invariable oops, go back. The variable inorganic background of the urban environment. The figure sits in an almost unconscious position. He's a drunk. To the left are the bars of the window and the animated figures, male and female, half in, half out, with bread on display but out of reach of the poor old man. This is contrasted with the woody, textured verticals of the boards, which in turn contrast with the beautifully modulated and intensely detailed texture of the brickwork against which he leans, and the irregular, larger paving stones on which he is seated, with one leg awkwardly extended into the cobbled roadway to the right. There, on the right, the mundane life of the great city hurries on under the gray, fog-clouded light of dusk or dawn, I can't tell which. The garbage collector, as you can see in the background, guides his horses up the road while a cloaked and bonneted female figure hurries down the road intent on some errand or task. Thus, extreme poverty is contrasted both with petty bourgeois commerce, working class physical labor at its most degraded, and far off in the distance, rising like a vision out of the fog, across the river, over Blackfriars Bridge, the great commercial heart of the great city of London, and its spiritual manifestation, the city with a capital C and St. Paul's Cathedral. But it is we, the viewers of the print, who must provide or unpack these meanings. There's no trite symbolism or obvious moralization within the framework of the print itself, conceived under the aegis of a scrupulous and objective realism. For it is the stylistic structure of the composition that gives it its memorable power. Géricault leaves out nothing, generalizes not at all, provides the eye with a feast of information and meaningful relationships. And it is our discerning eye that must savor this with both pleasure and pain. Géricault created this lithograph when he was in London in 1821 as one of a series of 12 prints with a cover, a series titled, quote, Various Subjects Drawn from Life on Stone by J, they got his initial wrong, J. Géricault, and published by one of the major print editors in London, Rodwell and Martin, in the first months of 1821. And there are 12 of them, 13 counting the title, which form a suite of big English lithographs. And as I say, they're called Various Subjects Drawn from Its Really English Life. Géricault had a great deal of success with them. When the artist had visited England the first time, the year before, accompanying his gigantic raft of the Medusa on its triumphant London tour, and in those days, before there were movies, often huge paintings like the raft of the Medusa would be exhibited for money. People paid to see it and would spend 3 hours looking at it with magnifying glasses and oohing and eyeing at the horror, very much like a Cecil B. DeMille movie, I would say. But when he had a great success. He had not appreciated the art of his English contemporaries on that first visit. But on his second visit, he had an extreme change of heart, one might almost say an epiphany. For Géricault, sensitive to the social radar of the moment, now saw that the more democratic art of England, deliberately unelevated, genre painting, engaged with the telling details of the everyday contemporary life of its variously classed people, was in some way the art of the future, rather than the pompous, academic, would-be traditional set pieces of the Academy. He understood, partly instinctively, that England, a leader in commerce, trade, and spectacle, the innovator of the Industrial Revolution at just that era, was also producing a new, more democratic kind of art, an art he wished to participate in the production of. The lithograph was the most up-to-date medium of the time, and the depiction of the lower classes in their daily activities, the subject. On May 1st, 1821, after seeing the summer exhibition of the Royal Academy, he writes to his friend an enthusiastic letter. People still wrote long, long letters. I told my father the other day, I'm quoting, that the only thing your talent lacked was to be steeped in the English school. I repeat it to you since I know you have appreciated the little you have seen of its work. The exhibition, that is the Royal Academy exhibition, just opened has again confirmed me in the belief that color and effect are understood and felt only here. You cannot imagine the beauty of this year's portraits and of many of the landscapes and genre scenes, and of the animals. Of course, Géricault loved animals probably much more than he liked people. He was literally in love with horses, and his early death at the age of 32 was caused by a fall from a horse. And of the animals painted by Ward and Landseer, then aged 18. The old masters, he says, have not done better in this line. One must not be ashamed to go back to school, he says. In art, one arrives at beauty only by comparisons. Every school has its character. If only one could unite all these qualities, would that not be perfection? It takes effort and great love. I see that the painters here complain that their drawing is inferior and envy the French school is more accomplished. And don't we, too, complain about our faults? What stupid pride closes our eyes to them? Can we bring honor to our country by refusing to see the good wherever we find it, and by insisting foolishly that we are the best? Shall we always be our own judges? I formed a wish at the exhibition that a number of paintings before me might be placed in our museum, meaning the Louvre. I wanted them to be a practical demonstration, more useful than prolonged reflection. The series that he did indeed deals with the various subjects offered by the British scene of the time, various types, activities, and classes, with horses racing, out for a run, being groomed, or shod, prominent among them. But none are more memorable than the 3 lithographs devoted to human misery, the fate of the most poverty-stricken, isolated, and dispossessed of the poor. This is the introductory lithograph of the series, and they're big prints, they're not small, which has the title, Various Subjects Drawn from Life and on Stone, they're lithographs, by mistake, J. Géricault. And the ragged man on the right, who looks like a garbage man, and this actually looks like a garbage truck, but it probably was used to carry his Raft of the Medusa, an enormous painting, to the exhibition hall. And the sign says, Raft of the Medusa on the right. This is the final print, horses descending to on the wharf, which is almost like a presaging of hell or death or darkness. I mean, it ends with the back of the horses going into this darkness under the brick arch. But, as I said, None of these prints are more poignant or memorable than the three lithographs devoted to human misery. Pity the Sorrows, the Paralytic Woman on the right, and the Blind Piper. And it's to a detailed examination of all three of these that I now turn. For there is really nothing like these prints in the entire visual repertory of poverty, either in the period following the Industrial Revolution or, in my opinion, ever. In the words of Régis Michel, who along with Lawrence Eitner has written most profoundly and richly about Géricault, quote, "The printmaker tracks down the misery-filled margins of a proletarian city. He is probably the first to make himself the interpreter of the lower depths of the metropolis, to criticize by means of the image the social cost of the Industrial Revolution." First of all, brick and brickwork are omnipresent in the setting of all the works featuring misery in the series, as well as in its closing iteration, the Adelphi Wharf that you just saw. And I got so interested in brick that I did a 2-week study of brickwork. There are a lot of wonderful books on brick, telling how they're made, how they're used, bricks in all different countries. And to my delight, the apartment house across the street from me is now having all its bricks revamped, and there are guys on ladders and those hanging things, knocking away at the brick and installing them. So I got some personal tips from them about how brick is used. But you can't understand these prints without learning about brick and getting excited about brickwork. Brick architecture functions as metaphor, metonymy, and environmental reality for the representation of London misery. It is the very sign of the new, overcrowded, poverty-stricken London of commerce and industry. But at the same time, on the formal level, it acts as a kind of proto-grid, let us say, to borrow from Roz Krauss, a proto-grid holding the surface of the paper at the same time that it menaces us with its structural monotony and closure. The brickwork grid is literally one with the menace of death in the graveyard to the left of the paralytic woman. But it makes its case for mortality in the setting of the other two misery lithographs as well. And they're all different and they're all essential to the impact of the prints. Bricks are of the essence in creating the setting for the misery of the industrialized poor. Even later, this is Gustave Doré's famous book, London, in which he shows all the London poor. And there's not a one of them where bricks are not a featured element of the setting. Oops, am I going? Pity the Sorrows has abundant sources in the popular arts of London. For example, in the children's poem on the left, I hope you can read a little bit of it, it's not great art, I can tell you. Or in the Gilray caricature on the right called Pity the Sorrows of a Poor Old Man, which represents Edmund Burke begging in 1796. And it's a very sarcastic view of the British government at the time. It's unlikely that Géricault knew the children's verse or more than its first few lines, and even more unlikely that he was aware of Gilray's caricature. And this is just to give you a sense of the currency of the theme at the time and before and after. In The Paralytic Woman, the setting, the comparison, and the interaction are even more evident. For example, the contrast between the delicate passivity of the protagonist and the monstrous coarseness of her attendant, who has stopped for a moment to lean against her primitive wheelchair. Other implications are derived from the graveyard prominent in the background and the posted handbill reading, "For all sickness and the ... And the contrast between the splendid horse-drawn hearse in the background, and he gets London fog. I guess it was something new for him, but fog is a constant visitor in the background of all these prints. The splendid horse-drawn hearse in the background, and the poor ad hoc, not quite funereal vehicle in the foreground. Or the contrast between the elegant toy horse carried by the richly clad little boy in the foreground. Yes, that is a little boy, and he is carrying a rocking horse, kind of toy horse, and the elegant rump of the rich man's funeral horse profiled in the background. A distinct narrative tension is created by the enigmatic glance, malevolent or frightened or both, that the nursemaid leading the child casts back over her shoulder at the paralyzed woman. Is this syphilis that is hinted at here? The prime urban disease for women as well as men? Possibly. Again, Géricault absolutely concentrates on specific details of setting, class, and texture. Brick again defines the urban environment. Wood is woody, rags contrasted with proper clothing, paper detailed in texture, light and dark appropriately distributed. As in The Pity, the Sorrows, the architectural framework is a protagonist in the creation of a meaning which is social, economic, and specifically individuated at once. The miserable paralytic woman and her attendant are enframed by the stout vertical of the end of the graveyard on one side and the background processional of dead prosperity on the other. The observing nursemaid and her charge are thrown into relief by the brick rectangle directly behind her and reiterated in the enclosing rails. But this print has a double focus, perhaps. The down-and-out chair pusher, hideous though he may be, is as much an alienated London figure as the dead-to-the-world female burden he pulls. The specificity of place Géricault created is attested to by an 1827 map of London of about the same period, which places the poor old man at a site on the south bank diagonally across from St. Paul's and across Blackfriars Bridge. Down there is where he's sitting, and over there is St. Paul's, and that's Blackfriars Bridge. He's right, more or less, where Tate Modern is today. I don't think Géricault thought about that, but anyway. Géricault even devotes a separate print to a seemingly minor element of the lithography, of the lithograph. The dustman, or what we call a garbage man, with his cart and horses in the background. He wants to get it just right. He cares about specific details. He does that afterward. Now, Goya, too, represented the miserable beggars. He did several series of drawings and brush drawings devoted to the subject, in ink, in brush, and later in charcoal. Yet, what's interesting is that nothing could be more different from Géricault's understanding of the nature of misery, economic misery, in the early 19th century. And this is very much due to the fact that beggary occupied a very different place in the social and political system and ideology of Spain than it did in post-industrial England. These are from album C. Let me see what I got here. Yeah. Album C, the one right next to him, which is about from 1808 and is made with, by brush with gray and black wash, and it's in the Prado. Certainly, this is one of Goya's most expressive works. The man wears picturesque rags, masterfully rendered by Goya's masterful brushstrokes, in the words of the catalogue of Goya and the Enlightenment. In his right hand, he holds a hat out for alms, but he also reaches out with his left in order to make his plea sadder and more effective. His worldly goods are strapped on his back. The facial expression, with its wide open, almost bulging eyes and open mouth, and the rank, matted hair, make of this beggar a paradigm of absolute indigence, a living incarnation of hunger and extreme degradation. Yet the immense difference in visual appearance between Goya's and Géricault's imagery of misery is not due merely to individual differences of style and attitude. It has to do with the unbridgeable chasm between the social meaning of misery in economically backward Spain, one of the most economically reactionary countries in Europe in the late 18th and early 19th century, and post-industrial England of the time, the most economically and materially advanced. Goya, although he may have felt the deepest sympathy with the suffering victims of war in his Disasters of War or of the Inquisition, evidently felt little pity for the victims of economic injustice, an attitude shared by many of his even most intellectually advanced compatriots. In the case of the wash drawing entitled "For Not Working," all the things are inscribed in his own hand. Goya does not appear to have felt compassion for this creature. His inscription is emphatic. The man has fallen into this degraded state because of not working. A severe judgment against the idleness in which many in Spain lived, ruining themselves and therefore the country. A universal theme among Goya's Enlightenment contemporaries was this repudiation of idleness and a similar denunciation of shameless begging. Campomanes, an economic and educational reformer of the period, estimated that there were 140,000 beggars in Spain. He backed economic reforms for the most miserable, but nevertheless blamed the existence of so many beggars on what he regarded as, and I quote, an innate Spanish disposition to idleness. Melendez Valdez, in the Legal Essays, published in 1821, the very year Géricault created his images of the poor, condemned the, quote, moral decadence and brutalization of beggars without a country, without a fixed home, without the least obligation or care, prone to drink and filthy slovenliness. For Melendez Valdez, like his enlightened contemporaries, among them Goya, poverty that led to begging, lying, crime, and punishment brought about the debasement and dishonor of the nation. He went on to say that mendicancy was a plague that degrades and destroys society, and he who sanctions it with injudicious alms has failed in his civic duty, unwittingly fostering the physical and moral perversion of his fellow citizens. That poverty, and especially mendicancy, were more prevalent in Spain than elsewhere in Europe seems to be substantiated by their being described as typical of the country in foreign travelers' accounts. Beggars' arrogance, underhandedness, their feigning of diseases and pretended repertory of distressing gestures was frequently commented on. So begging was a time-honored occupation looked on with scorn, derision, and even anger by Goya and his Enlightenment circle. But this difference in attitude is mirrored in a difference in style and structure of the representation. There is very little setting in Goya's work, very little explicit characterization of where this mendicancy is taking place. Rather, there is emphasis on the virtuosity of Goya's brush, its movement, and not the nuances of the individual sufferer. Goya represses narrative, has no overt sympathy with the crippled beggars in these carts that he observed both in album C earlier in the century and then later when he was in exile in Bordeaux. He seems to be more interested in the ingenuity of the transportation, how they get a dog to pull the cart, how the wheels work, what happens when you have no legs, how do you display your hideously deformed leg while you're pushing yourself in the cart. And again, there is very little sense of the contemporary environment as a factor in the composition, though they're fabulous drawings, but not very sympathetic. Even when alone in Goya's, in Géricault's representation of the third of these Misère lithographs, even when the figure is alone, Géricault constructs a sense of misery and doom by imprisoning the figure in its urban setting with its ruinous irregularities imposed on the gridded materiality. His musician is a unique individual. His ragged clothing points to a better past. His little dog patiently waits, and isn't that a pathetic dog? Patiently waits and almost seems to be listening. He is blind. What is he playing? His music is silent. His space of existence both empty and constricted. Géricault knew that in England, in the more democratic art of England, with its telling details of everyday contemporary life, was really what he was after. In all three of these lithographs, he pits urban unfeelingness, the hollow power of the city against human misery. And it's true, you can find sources and so on. There's a Rembrandt. But his blind musician, even though it has a rather cute little dog, is grotesquely othered, kind of made into somebody else, not empathized with. His dog is uncaring, there's a sketchy background, not those containing brickworks. Where am I at? Géricault's piper, as I said, like his drunken beggar, like his paralytic woman, is entirely different from any other representation of the subject, contemporary or historical. In the words of Sean Chesgren, author of Images of the Outcast, the Urban Poor in the Cries of London, Géricault's piper, showing a blind musician who plays unheard amidst a foggy wasteland of crumbling masonry, is tied to pity the sorrows in its oddly statuesque even heroic portrayal. Here are a whole lot of other cries of London, as they were called, and blind musicians and so on, images of the time, which Chesgrin says Géricault's is entirely different. Géricault's two lithographs embody a consciousness that is decisively modern, linked to defeat, failure of purpose, loss of meaning, and oblivion. Expressing their creators' astonishment at the misery of London's poor and the black horror of its slums in 1821, they take the depiction of backstreets and backstreet characters as far in the direction of anti-nostalgia as any artist does, perhaps as far as it can go, and still pretend to aesthetic purpose or hope to win buyers among the respectable classes of the 19th century. The apocalyptic tone expressed in the lithograph's backgrounds, which reek of industrial ruin, is intensified by their technical monotony, boredom, and incoherence, end quote. Well, yes and no, I think. When you look at them in the original, they are, although without personal flourish or signature style, anything but boring. They are, on the contrary, rich in realist veracity, in grasping what is going on out there, not in the self-concerned, self-aggrandizing personal touch of the great artist. In fact, part of their power and pathos arises from the fact that Géricault is deliberately reining in his prodigious virtuosity to create something which recalls the stiffness and naivete of popular prints, as Courbet was to do a generation later. The incoherence, so-called, is part of the realist project, the refusal to make beautiful or meaningful that which is neither. Chesgrin continues, quote, every form itself seems threatened in these anti-picturesque designs. And I would comment that, of course, the picturesque is always an effective way to mask the actuality of misery and abjection. Anti-picturesque designs in which pictorial structure exposes fundamental assumptions about society and its urban outcasts. In these willfully vapid designs, the city and the human condition are in ruins, devoid of order and without purpose. Well, willfully vapid, devoid of order. We are moving into the space and structure of the documentary, or the work of Courbet and the realists later in the century. Now I'm going to ask some questions. What was the work of the visual imagery of misery in the early 19th century Industrial Revolution period? What effects did it have, and on what segments of the public? Could images like these, which are women and children working in the mines, affect change? Well, in fact, these images, probably drawn as testimony by Lord Ashley's parliamentary committee investigating labor conditions in the mines, did have an impact. Their very imperfection, their crudeness, their total lack of either sentimentality or aesthetic quality made them all the more convincing as documentation, as presenting the painful truth. Obviously, the work of non-professionals, probably part of the witness accounts of Lord Ashley's Committee of 1842 on Conditions in the Mines, they and, oh, damn, now it can't, knew that would happen. Oh, sorry. Oh, sort of spoiled all the surprises. What was I saying? They and many written testimonials of child workers were part of the official report of the Parliamentary Commission, which achieved the passage of laws forbidding children to work in the mines. They had an impact. One might think of them as documentary photographs before the fact, drawn by the human hand, but a hand of such extreme modesty and invisibility, so to speak, that it might as well have been a lens. These pictures, which are crude wood engravings, after drawings, probably they appeared in the May 1842 report of the inquiry into the employment and conditions of children in the mines and manufactures, which made a sensation by exposing the degradation and hardship experienced by working children. In addition, the reports and evidence gathered by the parliamentary committee were illustrated by, quote, sketches made by the sub-commissioners themselves. The drawings were done on the spot at the instigation, apparently, of Dr. Thomas Southward Smith, one of the three commissioners. The effect, as Professor Selina Fox relates, was electric. The Times declared that the woodcuts were illustrative of the horrible and degrading labors to which too many of the unfortunate children employed in the coal mines appear to be subjected, and described the images in detail. One of these woodcuts represents a child dragging a small wagon full of coal on all fours, just like a beast of burden, and in a state of nudity, exclamation point. Of course, these were the early days of illustrated material in the mass media, enabled by wood engraving and other technical advances in the printing and publishing industries. There was, of course, a plethora of written evidence, including heartrending and equally untrained testimonials by the child laborers themselves. Here, for example, is the oral testimony of one Sarah Gooder, aged 8 years, taken down by the commissioners. Quote, I'm a trapper in the Gauber pit. It does not tire me, but I have to trap without a light, and I'm scared. I go at 4 and sometimes 3:30 in the morning and come out at 5 and 5:30. I never go to sleep. Sometimes I sing when I've light, but not in the dark. I dare not sing then. I don't like being in the pit. I'm very sleepy when I go, sometimes in the morning. Talk about naive, heartrending truth. But certainly the first prominent documentist, a photographer in this country, working at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, to take account of the terrible living conditions of recently arrived immigrants in New York City, was Jacob Riis, journalist, lecturer, totally accidental photographer, who started in 1888 his career as a non-professional documentary photographer. Riis, as Bonnie Jokelson points out in her major book about this photographer, Riis had no aesthetic pretensions with his camera. Quote, I had a use for it, and beyond that, I never went, he declared. In fact, as this author points out, he only took pictures for a few years. Nevertheless, it was Riis who, with the help of several other photographers, first used the new flash powder technology to make pictures of the slums. The emphasis on dirt, grotesque expressions, ugliness, and overcrowding, as well as the unartful compositions produced by the flash, greatly helped the cause of tenement reform. In works like 5 Cents a Spot, upper right, one of his most interesting and discomposed works, 1889, catching a glimpse of lodgers in a crowded Bayard Street tenement, the primitive flash effect is much in evidence. This was in a legal lodging house for 5 cents a spot, in which the huge influx of Italian immigrants to Mulberry Bend, as it was called, forced thousands of the homeless to sleep. This room and an adjoining one held 15 men and a woman and a week-old baby. Riis was proud of his prowess as an activator, if not as an artist. In his autobiography, he explained that he took the photo on a midnight expedition with the sanitary police, who reported overcrowding. Quote, "When the report was submitted to the health board the next day, it did not make much of an impression. These things rarely do. Until my negatives, still dripping from the darkroom, came to reinforce them. From them, there was no appeal." So photography worked when mere words didn't. These photographs, as you probably know, were collected in a book with the persuasive, if somewhat condescending, title, How the Other Half Lives. So Riis gave effective aid to the cause of better, healthier housing for New York's immigrant population. And that topos of the drunken, maybe dying, sleeping old beggar against the doorway, in this case with brick. I'm sure Jacob Riis knew nothing about Géricault or this series, but it is a topos that seized the imagination of the documentarist, as we are going to see. Another important documentary photographer at the beginning of the 20th century, Louis Hine, was mostly concerned with the issue of child labor, although in his work we feel a little more aesthetic engagement and a sense of the dignity and pathos which individualizes human beings as opposed to the mechanical repetition of the factory or mill setting. He never degrades his subject, I don't think. It is rather the system that he critiques. He fights for humans and especially children's rights to childhood. He is seemingly objective, indeed scientific and indexical, yet his subjects are posed for greater pathos, to rouse the viewer to action, and eventually to the creation of child labor laws. And I keep thinking of a poem I learned as a child, which is so apropos for Hine. The golf course lies so near the mill that almost every day the working children can look out and see the men at play, which I thought was a very good notion. Hine lent his photographs to projects actively working toward specific goals of improvement in slum housing, both inside and out, revealing the plight of recent immigrants with either a single figure or a whole family and the right, working at making paper flowers in a crowded tenement room. Perhaps the climax of documentary practice in the US occurred during the Depression in the 30s. Certainly, Dorothea Lange, as well as other FSA and Depression era documentarists, planned, chose, and changed their subjects for greater effect. All these photographs were to some degree meant to arouse the viewers to action, to support of New Deal programs for the alleviation of what was seen as mainly rural misery, the migrant and displaced families. These human beings were made to look as self-respecting as possible. We don't see any drunks or beggars or vagrants. The emphasis is on the family and the unfortunate uprooting and destruction of the family unit due to both natural and economic causes. And I think we're all familiar with Walker Evans' the extreme austere aestheticism of his images, in contradiction with the extreme degradation and deprivation of the settings in which they're placed. One of the most unusual, I think, of Walker Evans' photographs again uses that motif of the displaced and the deprived and the dying in this case, seated on the ground, here like the Madonna of Humility, which comes from the word ground, humus, with her sick and dying children around her. This is by Walker Evans. It's called Starving Cuban Family. And it's more unusual. It's not part of our USA Depression imagery. Is it posed? Were these children really dying? These are those questions that are asked of the documentary mode. Some of the photographs, the FSA photographs, were by well-known artists like Ben Shahn on the left, photograph called No Known Restrictions. Some were by lesser-known photographers like Russell Lee on the right. But all of the FSA documentary photography collection and others in the Smithsonian archives purport to be documentary, whether moderated by aesthetic concerns, as the Shahn surely is, and I might say a traditionally trained artist can hardly help but imbue his photographs with some kind of artistic values, to the almost overtly non-aesthetic qualities of Russell Lee's snapshot-like image. And as I said, all are to some degree calculated to arouse sympathy for the New Deal. Now I'm going to look at modern, or at least 20th century, versions of Géricault's theme, because, as I say, it's a favorite one. The sleeping outcast drunk on the pavement or doorstep outside a building with meaningful contextual elements. The work on the left is by a man called Tietjens. It's of 1938. It's from the Harlem project of a group of radical photographers, the Photography League, whose work you can now see at the Jewish Museum. By the post-war World War II era, the documentary came into its own, not necessarily, though, sometimes as a weapon of reform, but rather as a way of selling magazines and books, arousing interest and sympathy in the public media. Look magazine and Life magazine, with their documentary picture stories, flourished. Uplift was not always at stake. Sensationalism often was. So the Bowery, with its drunken so-called bums, became a theme à la mode. Yes, a morality story to be sure, but a picturesque slice of life for those who lived better, who knew they were better than that, even if they sympathized, as who wouldn't. But unlike FSA documentary, these were not necessarily calls to action and support. Like the 19th century or 18th century cries of London, they were an odd and objectionable form of the picturesque, tourist views of the Bowery for those who couldn't make it to New York. Sometimes, as in the Tietjens on the left, with an ironic touch of the sign at the right advertising precious metals by, as I said, a member of the Radical New York Photo League, which existed from 1936 to 1951, when the McCarthy Committee killed it. Some are merely anonymous and degrading images of abjection. And I must say, the Getty photography file has more of these than you ever want to see in your whole life. I mean, they have literally thousands of them. all engage in the trope of the drunken, quote, bum seated on the doorstep or pavement before a dwelling or a bar, the urban reject par excellence. Here's some more. The one on the right is by Lionel Rogozin, 1956. He did a terrific documentary on the Bowery and the men who live in its streets, sympathetic and political in its aims, for Rogozin was an activist left-wing photographer, but even such imagery of even minimal agency and interaction is rare. More common is the positioning of such outcast men as degraded outsiders, lying helplessly amid garbage on the pavement, with the understood implication that they too have fallen to the status of anonymous human garbage. With the work and texts of Martha Rosler, we confront, along with other people, the contemporary anti-documentary impulse at its most extreme, articulate, and effective. No wonder contemporary photographer and activist Rosler dismisses the documentary mode in no uncertain terms. We, the middle-class public, has been submerged in documentary through the media, through ads, through messages, through magazines. We have wallowed in it and the so-called sympathy or empathy it inspires. In the words of Rosler, sure, images that are meant to make an argument about social relations can work, quote, but the documentary, she says, has so far been granted cultural legitimacy and that it has no such argument to make. Its arguments have been twisted into generalizations about the condition of man, which is, by definition, not susceptible to change through struggle. This series, and the series is called The Bowery in Two Inadequate Descriptive Systems. It's by Martha Rosler, and it's a photo text work of 1974 to 5, and it's a series of 45 black and white gelatin silver prints mounted on 22 black mount boards. This series keeps the visual reality of the Bowery architectural setting, but substitutes the derogatory terms used to describe them for the living inhabitants of their streets. Says Rosler, there is a poetics of drunkenness, a poetry out of prison. Adjectives and nouns built into metaphoric systems applied to a particular state of being, a subculture of sorts, and the people in it. She continues, the photos represent a walk down the Bowery seen as arena and living space, as a commercial district in which the derelict residents inhabit the small portal spaces between shop and street. Here's another one. And she continues, the photos here are radical metonymy, with a setting implying the condition itself. I will not yield the material setting, she says, though certainly it explains nothing. The photographs confront the shop squarely, and they supply familiar urban reports. They are not reality newly viewed. There is nothing new attempted in a photographic style that was constructed in the 1930s when the message itself was newly understood, differently embedded. I am quoting words and images both. Well spoken, Martha, totally convincing. But are we willing to give up on visual representation without a murmur? Must we reject the undoubtedly questionable pleasures of visual representation if we are to rid ourselves of its ideological trappings? Or is that throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Isn't Rosler, in a sense, preaching to the converted, to a small, sophisticated in-group who know the recent history of photography, the art market, and all the latest theories of ideology. Which works best? And for what? And when? And for whom? Which intensifies the response for misery? Which, on the contrary, makes us consider the issue of the representation of misery itself? Is it possible even to represent misery at all in our media-saturated age? Now, some people obviously think so. These are works by Eli Levin, a not-so-young artist living in Santa Fe, who continues in the traditional mode of misery representation, likening drunken old men to the refuse they lie in. This sort of representation works perhaps better in the black and white print medium, like etching, where both the grimness, the documentary quality, and the formal structure, a sort of cubist and certainly aesthetically knowledgeable still life in the background, emerge more forcefully. As a final footnote to the representation of misery in the 19th and 20th century, the work of one of the only artists to grant agency to the poor and downtrodden, to construct the miserable ones as active, politically charged actors in history, making demands, resorting to physical violence in images of great power and originality. That is, of course, Katie Colvitz. The left work, which is a lithograph, is from the Weavers series of 1898, and the two right ones are from the Peasant War series of 1902 to 1908. Both of these series refer to actual historical occurrences in 1842 and 1526, respectively. And of course, these were times of great political activism in Germany, where Colvitz made her print cycles. Of course, both series, like the events they commemorated, end tragically, with the death of the strikers in the Weavers series on the left and the capture, eventual torture and execution of the peasant rebels on the right. But the series as a whole constituted powerful calls to action to the contemporary public of Colvitz's day. Though the young artist was nominated for a gold medal in the annual exhibition of 1898 by none other than Adolf Menzel, the emperor refused to grant her the medal. Her art produced results. And with these tragic endings, I will end my lecture without solutions or fixed conclusions about the representation of misery in the visual arts, but I hope with plenty of food for thought. Thank you.
I was struck by one of the photographs of the kids dying, and I remembered that Murillo painting of the kids on the steps, and because that's Spanish, I was wondering if you had any kind of
Well, Walker Evans knew his art history, I'm sure. I can't answer that because I really do not know the circumstances.
I mean, as far as when you talk about Goya, I mean, Murillo was like a century before, so I was wondering if there was a sort of a history in Spanish art of that of those ideas.
Not that I know. I would say those are two people who, I mean, he didn't, Goya didn't do a series of children lying on steps, did he? No. So it's Murillo.
He also had like children, sharing crusts of bread, and there's a lot of poverty.
In Goya's work?
No, in Murillo.
Oh, in Murillo, yeah. That was one of his specialties, was poor, picturesque children, yeah. But I'm not sure that he was doing it to change Spanish society. I doubt it. I think he was trying to some degree, arouse Catholic compassion for downtrodden children and so on, which is possible. But it's interesting that Walker Evans did that in Cuba, not in the United States. However awful the Gudgers and the whoever the other people were, whatever he called them, he never actually showed dead or dying bodies. He showed intense filth, poverty, lack of shame, as I say, degradation, which people have, I mean, there's always been a kind of division between people who say we must represent those things, like Riis's photographs, so we can have social action, and other people like Susan Sontag or Martha Rossler or other postmodern people who feel that this is simply taking advantage of those who can't protect themselves, representing people in this condition, and that we should just, start the revolution and not represent them. But I think this is easier said than done, and I am not sure that we should give up on visual art in our quest for greater justice. But it's interesting that there is a Spanish background to the Cuban picture. Good.
It's really interesting with Géricault's lithographs that he was an outsider in London producing those, whereas a lot of the other work you showed tonight, it was done in the native country. And then I suppose the Evans photograph in Cuba would sort of be going to a different country and perhaps being able to explore with more liberties because you're not representing your own society. And I would be curious to know more about that and how that served the purpose. And did Géricault do similar works for France before or
Well,
after?
he did more things about, yes, the impact of the Napoleonic Wars. A lot of wounded and horrible scenes after battles and so on. But not too much of the poverty of his country. But I think you have a real point. When de Tocqueville came from France to look at Manchester, everyone came to look at the city of Manchester, including Friedrich Engels, who wrote a great book about the misery of Manchester. When he went to Manchester, he simply couldn't find a vocabulary to express the horror of Manchester, how people were living like pigs in the dirt, getting up at 3 in the morning like that little kid, and children, mothers, fathers, all heaped together in rags, etc. And again, he was a Frenchman coming to England, but everyone found England extraordinary. I mean, Manchester was simply one place. Dickens came there. They couldn't find metaphors, the great writers of England, when they came, because nothing like it had ever appeared on the face of the earth. It was like hell. I mean, they used, biblical metaphors maybe. But I do think you're absolutely right, that coming from a foreign country, like de Tocqueville, like Géricault, makes you see things that the natives just think are picturesque, or natives were doing, for the most part, stuff like the Cries of London, which are picturesque images of poor people selling things in the street. But it took Géricault, and it had to be somebody like Géricault, who had this immense human sympathy and the ability to construct images that conveyed it. We don't know what he would have gone on to do, because he died 2 years afterward. I mean, this is somebody who's the age of a graduate student who's doing all this. He's already done the Raft of the Medusa, this enormous painting and a whole lot of other things. But he loves horses more than art in some ways. And I guess he must have ridden a horse that wasn't very safe. So we don't know what projects he might have done. He might have gone back down to France and done something similar back in his home country. But I do think the eye of the foreigner is really important. Although, of course, in a certain sense, when somebody like Jacob Riis, who was an upstanding middle-class person, went to these slum alleyways or rooms, crowded rooms, it was like he was going to another country. I mean, they were Italian, they were, different from him anyway, as were practically all the documentary photographers. We don't have too many records of the impoverished taking photographs of each other. So you might say that within the country, it was one group taking photographs of the other. But I think anytime you go to a foreign country, you see things that the natural inhabitants don't, and that's a good point.
I'm very grateful for your lecture, and as a resident, I've been in the South Bronx for 30 years. We're supposedly the poorest congressional district in the United States, but what's fascinating is that we have a culture of such amazing joy. The hip-hop era started in our neighborhood. I wonder, you talk about misery, but it is a dialectic. It's amazing. People make art there, they take pictures of each other, the fashion, everything. Everyone makes art basically to kind of survive every day psychologically. And I want to know, I'm thinking of photographers like Helen Levitt.
Yes, okay.
Who is, who
Absolutely.
detects joy in a situation where people can't even imagine it. And I wondered what your feelings on that was.
I think Helen Levitt is wonderful. I mean, I think they're terrific photographs, but nevertheless, I don't think she ever lets you forget that these are people who don't have much of anything, and that this is an unjust situation. Yes, you can have joy under almost all kinds of situations, and children find games to play, no matter rich or poor or whatever. And I agree, Helen Levitt finds this, and to her credit, she doesn't eliminate the fact that these are poor children. They are making the best of difficult playgrounds, let's say, or they're very inventive. I agree. I mean, I wouldn't want to eliminate that, but I'm talking about misery and economic misery. And it's hard to envision how terrible things were in the early 19th century in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. I don't think little Sarah, aged 8, was feeling any joy, even though she sang once in a while when she had to get up at 3:30 in the morning and work till 5:30 in the mines. We forget, I think. See, I think Helen Levitt's children at least had a child's life in the city. But then there are extremes of oppression and economic lack that there is no joy in, and that's part of what I was trying to talk about. You're welcome.
All of a sudden, I'm thinking about William Kentridge as a contemporary Géricault. I was wondering if you had any comments.
Oh, I think he's right in the tradition, in a way. I mean, he's very much of the moment and very modern, but I see him in a line with Géricault and people fashioning new styles and modes of getting at modern hells and so on, and the pain of people who are economically and in every other way oppressed. I would say he's right in there, inventing things. Huh?
The historiography of drawing
Yes.
as fertile as the medium
Yeah, I mean, I think people are, yes, using it. Well, it's the graphic medium, and it's good for this sort of thing.
I'm still trying to pull a question out of my thoughts, but as I was listening to your talk and looking at the images and thinking about the representation of misery, certainly post-industrial revolution, like an urban context and architecture was a subtext of your talk. You were talking about, the brick structure in the Géricault image, and then, leaping ahead to the Martha Rosler, the space between the sidewalk and the storefront. And what comes to mind for me as well is Gordon Matta Clark's deconstructions and his influence of the situationist influence on him and the reaction to capitalistic cumulative strategies. And so, maybe like I'm trying to produce sort of like a parallel counter visual narrative that is a representation of misery via, architectural images.
Yeah. Well, you can take it anywhere. I mean, that's an interesting. I try to keep it very fixed on one thing, but I think you can expand the ideas or the notion of the urban fabric lending itself to every aspect of the human condition. And certainly the situationists, they're the new chic urbanists. And I'm not sure they were really focused. They hated people with power, and they hated fixed kind of thing. But I don't know how they felt about misery. I haven't read anything that they ever said about it. But it's clear that they hated the whole economic and social system of our urban society. That's clear. And they loved cities, though. They loved weaving their way through the mystery of cities, which you can't do as well if you have nothing to eat, maybe. I don't know. But I'm going to think about that. Right.
Hi. I'm curious if you have any idea of why buyers would want these prints, the Géricault.
Yeah, well, he had to be careful in a certain sense. Yes, why would they want them? Because some of them might be French buyers, of course, and this would be varieties. It's varieties, He put them in amid various subjects. There are also people, what do you call them, blacksmiths shoeing horses and country wagons and rich people or rich racetrack people. He did the races at Epsom. So it's a variety. People could think they were buying every aspect of. And he did very well with the series. And also, the English people could assimilate this kind of thing to familiar previous collections, like various people did Cries of London, which would be poor itinerant merchants selling vegetables or milk or playing the fiddle or all the colorful life of the poor on the streets of London. So you could sort of weave this in if you weren't too bright and sensitive, as many of the middle class people weren't. They just thought they were getting good art of our city by a Frenchman, I think. That was part of it. I mean, it's interesting because you can fool art buyers. I mean, think of Goya's portraits of Ferdinand. Was it Ferdinand VII and his family? Would you buy a portrait like that? I mean, that made you and your family look like driveling idiots and so on. But they never noticed. I mean, they just thought it was a wonderful portrait, and look how he did the lace and the diamonds and stuff. It's great. I think they just thought it was variety, various divers. This is how it is. I'm sure that was the only reason. And as what's his name? Sean Shigren, who wrote this wonderful, very socially moving book on the cries of London through history. He said that in a way he had to be aware of how far he could go, even in these pictures. I mean, nobody's already dead. He didn't show that guy dead. He's just dying. And he's still got a dog. And, you know, he accommodates a little bit, but not much.
Hi. So in your book on the body in pieces, you talk about the kind of the dignity of the vertical and the abjection of the horizontal. And I was just wondering if this is something that you think separates Géricault's images that you showed us today from kind of later depictions of poverty and the kind of insistence on the horizontality of being one with the refuse?
Yeah, I think it does. He never does that. He would never do that. Maybe some of the wounded, even his wounded are holding each other up, even if they've got one arm missing and they're blinded, they're helping each other. No, in general. I mean, the topic of the Madonna of humility is very appropriate, you know. Sitting on the ground was considered debased and abasing, and lying on the ground was kind of the depths, that you could go no further. So I think that's true, that horizontality is tied in with total abjection and degradation of the image maker. Yeah.
Hi. Right there.
Yeah.
Hi. It seems to me that latent in your discussion is the other end of the spectrum beyond activism would be exploitation. And images like this that show the poor or the dejected in art, and then which are, you know, sold to buyers. And the question of how that arose, maybe not necessarily for Géricault at that time, but in images now, and how it makes us look, I think, or approach images of the poor with a certain skepticism, especially in a documentary style. And I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, of course. And even if they rouse our sympathy, what do? I mean, it's hard to say. But you see, I think image work has to be done in a total context. It's not you just go to the art dealer and buy an image and feel, oh dear, how awful. It has to be part of some kind of project for change, or you can freely admit you kind of like the art part of it, and that's that, and you're not going to pay any attention. And what has happened, of course, and we all know this, and since I saw the art market for photography literally being constructed within my living memory, I mean, we used to order Walker Evans photographs from the Smithsonian. And anyone could get a Walker Evans photograph for $5. We had them all over the wall. I think they weren't quite the right size. They might have been developed not as gorgeously, but they were fine. I mean, that's what photographs were for. They were like prints were for. Prints were originally to make like print, Gutenberg, all that, was to make the distribution of printed matter, including later on, engravings, et cetera, more available to a wider audience. Now, right from the beginning, printmaking in the late 15th, 16th century began to divide itself up into exquisite connoisseur prints for the rich and the connoisseurs, the knowledgeable, and sort of cheap version, woodcuts, pretty crude, kind of wonderful actually, for poorer people who could afford them. And Dürer made both. I mean, he made different sets. He would make one engraved, refined set of the Passion or something for the rich collectors back in his day, and a cruder, a more dynamic set for more ordinary people. But photographs were going to be a way that everyone could get a hold of images. I mean, because they were so easy to reproduce and they didn't wear out. And it was, as I say, you could, from the Library of Congress, you could just get all kinds of wonderful photographs, including Walker Evans. And then somebody figured out, or a lot of people figured out, hey, there's a market here. We can do, what do you call them, heritage prints, or is that tomatoes? One of them, something like that. What are they called? Vintage, sorry. Tomatoes are heritage. Prints, photographic prints are heirloom. Yeah, oh, heirloom tomatoes, sorry. Anyhow, you know, you begin to make catalogue raisonné. I mean, in some ways it's sort of absurd. I don't get it. The whole point of a photograph is its availability and repeatability. People excise photographic, you know, what do you call them, negatives and so on. It's a very interesting notion. So what happens, as Martha Rossler and other people have pointed out, is that what were once heartfelt documentary images meant to change people, support the New Deal, which may be very mild in a way, but still it meant something to people who had nothing, suddenly become, you know, expensive, limited edition, auctionable, etc. So it's not that the photographs change, it's their, not use value, what's the other value? Exchange value, that changes. I mean, they become counters in a very different kind of economic system. Whether people believe or don't believe, I mean, I still think images make a difference in context, not just you hold up one image of a poor child and it reforms somebody's life, but together with political action and print and so on, it can work. It can have some effect, I think.
Hi. You mentioned,
I'm going to sit down.
Pity the sorrows of an old poor man made you cry. And I was wondering compositionally why that was more arousing to you than the Rossler piece.
Then the what?
Than the Rossler piece.
Why?
Yes.
Because the picture, I mean, it's a picture that goes to my heart. You're not meant to feel things with the Rossler pieces. You're supposed to think. That's why it makes me cry. I don't cry when I look at an empty storefront with a lot of words on the other side. I mean, I utterly see what she's getting at, and I sympathize and agree up to a point. But it is not meant to do the same kind of work, let us say, as the more traditional in some ways Géricault, but very innovative one. And partly why the Géricault touches me is that it so rejects traditional sentimentality. It kind of keeps you at arm's length at the same time that it drives you in. It is not sentimental. It is, and it is not exhibiting virtuoso, you know, you can't see the de Kooning stuff in there. It's very neutralized, and Géricault is a virtuoso draftsman, but he keeps it neutral. He's a realist, and I'm a realist. That's, I think, partly.
That very briefly, and what do you think about people like George Gross, who have a satirical aspect and who shows misery across
Yeah,
classes?
No, I think I think that whole German group is excellent. I mean, I wasn't going to show the whole history of art, but I think he is terrific. I object very strongly to the fact that it's so often women who embody all the vices, sins, and temptations of the world. That, I feel, sort of turns me off. But no, I do sympathize. I do. I think he's very effective until he comes to the United States.
Thank you, Linda.
Okay.